All right, time for football at 4. Johnny Mac's in the house at JF McMullen, 97.3, ESPN.com, Sports Illustrated. Covers the Eagles and the NFL. We get into it every day as a lot of NFL stories happening as free agency continues. We also know Howie Roseman spoke today, and there was a lot of nuggets to take from that particular conversation. We'll do that now here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline with John McMullen from 97.3 ESPN.com. Johnny Mac, welcome back.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
All good. An hour today. Wide-ranging conference call, as you tweeted. Basically, thoughts on everything that's going on here, and he kind of hit on just about everything, and I guess we can kind of go through each layer here. One of which I thought, he got into was the wide receiver position. It's a position that has not been addressed in free agency. And we brought it up yesterday about what if they like their receivers better than we do? In other words, why sign mediocre wide receivers, bring them in here, and if we're going to have Deshaun Jackson and Alshon Jeffrey back, and they're both healthy, these mediocre receivers aren't going to play over them anyway. We're just going to upgrade in the draft. That's going to be. And are they looking at Jackson and Alshon as mid-level free agent acquisitions almost?
Well, I think that's the case with Deshaun. I think there's always the hope that he's going to be healthy, he's going to be back, he's going to play at a high level, at least for, say, 12, 13 games. I think you kind of understand even in a best-case scenario, he's going to pull a hamstring or something of that nature, going to lose a couple games. What can't happen is what happened last season, where he essentially misses the entire season, really just one game, and he was spectacular in that season opener. So from that, yeah. From Alshon, look, I mean, this team is trying to convince somebody else to take him in a trade, and that's difficult for so many different reasons, because not only do you have the issues on the field and the fact that he's not healthy, and he's not, nobody's going to have an off season with the coronavirus and the pandemic. So it's not about being ready for off season work, which he wouldn't be anyway here. He's not going to be healthy until best case scenario or season opener very early in the season. Worst case scenario, probably middle of the season, midway through, and probably more likely the latter than the former. So it's going to be tough to get somebody to not only take on that contract, but take on that contract understanding he's going to have to be coming into a new situation and he's not healthy anyway. So, it's kind of like the Eagles' perspective. It's like, well, we got him anyway. There's nothing we can do. So let's just play this game and play the long game and see what happens. And but I don't think they're counting on him by any stretch of the imagination. What they are counting on is, as you mentioned, they're going to get a receiver likely in the first round of the draft. You hope Deshaun comes back. And J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. I mean, I think if you poll the fan base, everybody's given up on the guy. He was a rookie. You can't sugarcoat it. He was terrible. He didn't contribute. But to assume you're going to give up on a guy after 1 year in this league, that's just not how it works. And that's the kind of thing that Howie was saying. Essentially, we think more of our receiving group than you do, and specifically talking to the fans more than anything else.
Yeah, because it sounded like he thought that the receiver price range kind of dropped as free agency wore on, but that they didn't, kind of account for that and almost didn't set their budget in the offseason to go down that road because they thought it was going to be more expensive than maybe they indicated.
Yeah, and I think that's in relation to a Robbie Anderson type or a Brashad Perryman type. And Anderson's camp was pretty upfront that they were going to be looking for a pretty significant deal, $13 million a year, somewhere in that range for an average annual value. And the Eagles weren't interested in anything like that at that price. ultimately that market wasn't there. It comes down to 2 years and $20 million essentially. And if they had budgeted for that, who knows? I still think that would have been a little bit too rich for that type of person. And Perryman at 1 year, $8 million. Yeah, look, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, you can get out of it. So he would be in that category as well. But you hit the nail on the head, Mike. I mean, these are, I don't want to call them mediocre receivers, maybe a tick above mediocre. And ultimately, you want to get better anyway. So you have this draft that is supposed to be historically deep at the position. So in a best case scenario, you're not even going to need those players. And I think that's how the Eagles looked at it.
John, I asked this to Gil on the other side before Football at 4, and the question was this. Do you think – but first of all, it seems like Howie now, after that press conference today, or conference call, I should say, is strongly in the corner of Alshon Jeffrey, where maybe a couple months ago or whenever the timeline goes back to, he was a little bit more open-minded and he wasn't committing to either side. Now, I know the contract and the injury history is a difficult sell, but do you think he tried and realized, all right, this really isn't happening, and now he's just committed and all in on what they have?
No, I don't think he's all in by any stretch of the imagination. As I said, it's I'm putting it at a receiver is going to be taken in the first round of this draft. There is a certain amount of gamesmanship that goes on in these types of situations. I just kind of laid out the issues with Alshon Jeffrey. It's tough to convince another team that has that information. They might not be around him every day, but they know he's not healthy. They can see the film. They could see he was a descending player before he got hurt. And then you have all the off-the-field stuff as well. So it's not like you can pick up the phone and fool somebody. They have that information just as you have that information. Now, what happens if you go all the way back to the Sam Bradford trade, if something happens, you have a couple injuries when we do get this thing ramped up, hopefully in training camp somewhere else. Alshon is ahead of schedule, is maybe on the verge of coming back, and you have a wide receiver desperate team, it changes the situation. You're out of, that's how we likes to call it, talent acquisition season. So by that point, if you're another team and you haven't addressed the position the way you wanted in free agency in the draft, and you start to get it a little desperate, things change. And that's, I think, the Eagles' hope more than anything else. They're not all in on Alshon Jeffrey, and I would still say it's far more likely than not he's not going to have an impact on this offense very much at all this upcoming season.
Yeah, Howie also talked about the moves that they've made so far on the defensive side of the ball, and maybe help me with some clarification here, but essentially saying we weren't planning on maybe doing everything that we've done so far, but we saw opportunities and we took them. Now, what they've done so far, does that maybe impact or change some plans that they potentially had for the offensive side of the ball?
Yeah, it always changes, and that's why I always joke that mock drafts are always a fruitless exercise. I mean, all of them, up to the day of the draft, but they're really, really silly before free agency kicks in, because look at the Eagles as an example. Some had said, well, they need a receiver. That's the biggest need. But if they don't like any of the receivers there, maybe they go corner. Well, now they got Darius Slay. They got Nickel Coleman, and they're not taking a corner in the first round. And you say, well, what do the Eagles like to do? They love to build up front. They need another defensive tackle. Maybe they'll take a defensive tackle. Well, no. Now they have Javon Hargrave. So it clarifies things dramatically, and there are phases to the offseason, obviously. And once you get done adding significant parts in free agency, then you can look at your roster and say, okay, we really need this in the draft. And that's happened for the Eagles. It's clarified things. They really, really need a wide receiver. They really, really need a linebacker in one of these premium rounds, be it in the second or third round. So that's kind of what happens in every city.
John McMullen, Football at 4. I want to get into what he mentioned today on the defensive scheme. It sounded as if he thought the new personnel might mean that the scheme is going to evolve a little bit. In other words, hey, Darius Slay, we get it. He's a guy that can move around the field. Jim Schwartz might have to adapt and be more willing to let him flip the field. And I'm not saying Schwartz doesn't want to do that or never would. It's just he didn't have a player to really do it with. But did you get the sense that Howie was indicating that the scheme could evolve based on the new personnel they have? It's a lot more flexible, versatile, kind of Swiss Army knife-esque type of talent he has in that secondary now, it seems.
Yes and no. I think the bigger part of that is you have Darius Slay, so you have, in theory, a potential lockdown corner. And that enables you to do a lot of different things as a defensive coordinator when it comes to the blitz game and blitz packages, so that'll excite everyone, the potential to blitz more, because you do have a corner who can hold up outside by himself, makes it a lot easier. It's not necessarily an evolution, whereas you're looking at the defensive coordinator and saying, well, now he's going to figure out that these are different packages and change things. No, it's just you have more talent, so it opens up other layers of the defense that already existed. As far as Howie called Jalen Mills a positionless player today. And that's one of the things I asked him about was all the versatility. And he talked about Will Parks' versatility. He basically intimated that Jalen's going to take over a Malcolm slot, which we've also said on the show, and that's the Eagles' plan. But, I mean, that's the way the league is going as a whole, and nobody has done it more than Jim Schwartz and the Eagles. So, I mean, Malcolm played 7 different positions. So they've already been ahead of the curve as far as that moving part with the chess pieces. The Eagles hope that they have more of those types of guys, but I also want to pump the brakes there. And it's not the be-all, end-all, but contracts are meaningful. And you get excited by these statements, but Jalen signed a 1-year, $5 million deal, only $2 million guaranteed. Parks signed 1 year, $1.6 million. These are not superstar players. So to assume they're going to go in and beat Malcolm Jenkins, even a descending Malcolm Jenkins, boy, I think that's a tall order. That's March talk. That's before you see it on the field in the summer, and you go, oh yeah, Malcolm's pretty good.
Right. No, and I saw that he kind of made the inference that, hey, he played safety against Alabama in a game, when he was at LSU. Hey, he could do it at this level because he did it there, which, hey, again, I have contended that Schwartz feels that he can trust him the most to say, hey, I'm going to give you the role that I had Jenkins because I trust that you can do it more than anybody else. Like, not that you can do it or will do it at the same level, but you're the guy that I feel most likely I can mold to that. But I guess there's a lot like Avonte Maddox. It sounded like today Roseman was like, yeah, he could play outside. I mean, he compared him like Darrell Green, for God's sakes.
Yeah, and by the way, these are all names that are not fair. It's not fair to compare Jalen Mills to Malcolm Jenkins. It's not fair to compare Avonte Maddox to Darrell Green or somebody of that nature. And if you do, you're going to be disappointed. And that's why I said it's March talk. But, I mean, Avante has shown great versatility, and the game has changed. And we just talked about Mills and Parks, and the ability to play different positions on the back end is more important now than it has been in the past. And I think you're right, Mike. You hit the nail on the head. Yeah, Jalen is the guy Jim most trusts to be able to move all over the chessboard. But again, that doesn't mean he's going to handle all the positions as well as Malcolm did. That, for instance, you could argue he might handle some better. Like in theory, as he spent his entire NFL career to this point, if you're going to put Jalen in the nickel, big nickel look that Malcolm played so often, he might be better. But if you're going to ask him to play linebacker, like Malcolm would often do, he's probably not going to be better. And as a whole, just the natural box safety position, strong safety, all these different things that Malcolm did, that's a really good player. And I agree he was descending. I don't even have a problem with the Eagles moving on, but the assumption that somebody who's never done that is going to turn into Malcolm Jenkins overnight, that's too much for me.
John, there's always been a major importance for Jim Schwartz type defenses on the defensive line and edge rushers. So far this offseason, we've seen Howie, as you've detailed, be aggressive in continuing to add to the secondary despite Malcolm Jenkins departing. Is he adding in those areas? We know he needed to add regardless, but do you see him adding an edge rusher still? And if this is the defense that goes into the season, are you confident in the personnel that they have? Or I know you mentioned linebacker a lot, but outside of linebacker, just defensive line and secondary, is it good enough?
I think the defensive line is good enough. I think the secondary has potential to be good enough and be better, certainly than it was prior, mainly because of the addition of Slay and having essentially what will be the best cornerback in the Peterson-Schwartz era for this team, and argue maybe the best nickel corner as well, so you can add that to the mix. And Hargrave next to Fletcher Cox. And look, every team in this league has issues. You can't fix every position. Even the Kansas City Chiefs, the Super Bowl champions, they have issues. So it's not like you need to be solidified at every single position. Could they use another edge rusher? Yes. But if they have to cobble it together with Brandon Graham and Derek Barnett and Josh Sweat and Jannard Avery, and who knows, Joe Osman might be back, and they could do it, and they could win, and they could be at a successful level. Linebacker, is the one position where I say today they cannot be successful with how it's cobbled together right now. But the good news is the draft is still there. There's still time to add people to this team, and certainly there will be significant additions with that first, second, third round pick.
John, I guess, he did, we'll go back to that, the wide receiver stuff, because, he did mention Alshon as the elephant in the room, and we know he's got to kind of dance around that. However, he did, what was your takeaway on the DeAndre Hopkins stuff and why maybe, Howie's always willing, and it didn't seem that the Eagles were closely attached to his name, but did he at least intimate that they were involved?
Yeah, they were involved, and I'm glad he went on the record with it, because now I can talk about it, because he had let us in on that before. The Eagles made a conversation. The issue wasn't anything involving the player, obviously. That's arguably the best receiver in the world. And any team should have been trying to get DeAndre Hopkins, I joked, including the Houston Texans. I don't care who you like. If you like Henry Ruggs and you think he's going to be a superstar, if you like CeeDee Lamb, if you like Jerry Jeudy, probably not going to be there for the Eagles at 21, but none of those three are going to be as good as DeAndre Hopkins. So if you were able to get that kind of receiver into your program, I think that would have been a slam dunk. The problem is he had 3 years left on his deal, and he didn't want an extension. He didn't want a tweak. He wanted it ripped up. He wanted a completely new contract. And the Eagles aren't going to do business that way for a number of reasons, but mainly precedent, because they don't want to set that precedent and say, well, they ripped up Hopkins' contract. I'm an all-pro. Rip up my contract with 3 years to go. Eagles weren't going to go down that path, and that's the reason they bowed out. And it wasn't.
Was there not, John, money and years left on the Slay deal, or was that minimal?
1 year left, and the Eagles did an extension, and that's the difference. And by the way, they're still getting that final year. This year is under his existing contract, and they gave him a 3-year extension.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, completely different situations, and they often do extensions with their own players. They did Lane Johnson last year, Brandon Brooks, but not with 3 years left. That was one of the issues with Malcolm, and the fact that they didn't want to talk about tweaking his deal with 2 years left. So the precedent was the issue. It had nothing to do with the player, nothing to do with them saying, we're too good at wide receiver. We don't need DeAndre Hopkins. They know how good he is. They were interested, but what he was asking for. And to be honest, most good organizations are going to say the same thing. They're not going to rip up a contract with 3 years left.
Who wins the stare down? I know we talked quickly about it yesterday. Who wins the stare down? The NFL or the GMs on draft day? Did Howie make any indication whether he thought that day was going to be pushed?
Yeah, he doesn't. It's not going to get pushed. The NFL's already made that decision. But he was asked, what would he prefer? And he kind of begged off. He didn't answer that. He said, we'll just go by the rules that were given. And I think the biggest issue, I from what I understand, Howie was in the category that would have liked to push the draft back. He's not going to admit that and go against what the league says. But it's generally all the GMs in the cities that have been the hardest hit by the pandemic. So places like New York and Philadelphia, San Francisco, they had to shut down far earlier than some certain other cities. And some were open until the NFL shut everybody down. I think April 6th was the date. So they're trying to even the playing field as much as possible. But that was the issue from certain GMs in this league. They weren't allowed to do the types of things certain other organizations were doing, and that's why they wanted the pushback. But the NFL's kind of made that decision, and they're trying to level the playing field as much as possible.
All right, John McMullen, and you can follow him on Twitter, of course, at JF McMullen for Football at 4 every day. Tune in tomorrow with more on the NFL, the offseason. The draft is now less than a month away. We are getting into it as the Sports Bash rolls on with a Football at 4 edition for Thursday in the books. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.